Numbers 22. Numbers 22. Just some general, information for you about anytime that anything pops up in the news that deals with, creation type things. I like to read them and like to kind of bring those to your foreknowledge. You can kind of have I don't want to call it ammunition in your gun, but you can have some facts that you can kind of have packed away. Miranda mentioned these hurricanes and things that have hit, and it's been an extra busy hurricane season in 2020. Some people get chalked it up to the fact that 2020 has been a weird year. But I know that they've already ran through, of course, Weather Channel names those storms. They name the hurricanes, they name the tropical depressions, they name all of them. We've had enough. They've already been through the alphabet, which is the first time that's happened since. It's been several years, so I think since maybe they first started naming them. But anyhow, and of course, if you hear about these hurricanes and all these storms and even the forest fires that are going on, the driving force that most people tell you the reason that these things are happening is what? Climate change, right? Global warming. There are forest fires going on in California because of climate change, global warming. These hurricanes are here because of global warming and all this kind of stuff. That's what we hear. I was doing some reading this week, and you guys know I enjoy the idea of arguing with evolutionists and people who think that climate change is real, or global warming is real. Climate change is real. It's been changing since the beginning of God, since after the flood. But that's beside the point. We've already talked about that. But say all that. Say this: sunspots on the sun. Okay, sunspots are what causes a lot of our heat, and we are in what they call a solar minimum. Okay, and what that means is that the solar minimum means there's not as much heat. Solar minimum, not as much heat radiating from the sun. Makes sense? So during solar maximums, more heat radiates from the sun. More sunspots create more heat. Okay, that latent heat's how we get heat here on Earth. All right. And if you think about, just before I say anything else, think the fact that the sun is millions of miles away, and that heat is able to get here and heat the Earth up. We can't see the heat, but the heat is pretty cool, right? It's pretty amazing that that's how that works. But solar minimums mean that the heat is not pushing out as many sunspots, therefore not pushing out as much heat. Okay, which if there's not enough heat, what does that mean? There's not as much heat means what? We felt that in the last couple of days, right? It's kind of unusually cool here this time of September. Okay, now solar minimums mean that the overall temperature on the Earth has to be doing what? Cooling. Okay, now if the Earth is cooling, all right, that means that the waters, which is the driving force behind our weather, is cooling as well. Now you remember back probably 2000s, you heard all about the El Niños, right? El Niño causing all these storms. Well, because of the cooling, the solar minimum, we are in what they call a La Nina, which is the opposite of an El Nino. It means the water around the equator, okay, is cooler than it normally is. Now, when the water is cooler than it normally is, things are cooler, things more unstable. That's going to cause more and more activity in the atmosphere. That's the reason why we're having more storms this year than we've had in the past several years. If you go back, I think it was 15 or 20 years ago, we had the same kind of idea. Hurricane Katrina in 2005, that was during a La Nina, okay? And we had a lot of storms that year as well. Not as many as we have this year, but a lot of storms during that time as well. Direct reflection of the pattern of weather that we're in based on kind of where we're at on how the sun is putting out the heat, okay? Nothing to do with global warming. As a matter of fact, most of the studies say today that the Earth is actually cooler today than it was, overall temperature cooler today than it was 15 or 20 years ago, because we were in a solar minimum. All right? Now, forest fires that are going on in California. California, of course, has been an environmental hotspot for 50 years. Back when you all were my age, we had the tree huggers and all that kind of stuff that was going on and chaining themselves to the trees, don't cut the forest down. Well, that has led to the forest departments to not manage the forest out there, right? Around here, Do we have a ton of forest fires in the Appalachian Mountains? We don't, right? Up through Pennsylvania, the Appalachian Mountains, the Blue Ridge Mountains, we don't have the forest fires like they have out there. Now, our climate has been is equally as dry as their climate has been in the last 15 years. It has. It's actually been a little drier around here than it has out there, okay? But we manage our forests. We have controlled burns, and to get rid of the dead stuff that comes off the ground. They don't do that out there. They think it's an environmental problem. So now you've got years and years and years and years and years of all this dry, dead stuff laying on the forest ground. Some dum-dum comes through and decides to start a fire, and then that's why we have the huge amount of acreage that's burned off there as well. Now, God tells us specifically multiple times in His Word that we are to be stewards of the creation that He has given us, okay? We are supposed to manage the area around us, right? We're supposed to make sure we're taking care of it because God has given it to us. That has not been the case on the West Coast, and that is why the forest fires have ravaged them in the last 8 or 10 years like that. That's why they've been as bad as they've been. It's a direct reflection of how they have been treating God's creation, okay? Which, if you wanted to get political, you could say it's also a direct reflection of who's in charge out there, okay? But we don't like to get political up here, okay? But I wanted to bring that out and kind of tell you, because I mean, if you flip on the news, global warming, climate change is causing all these storms and all these forest fires, all this stuff that's going on. It's essentially just been a mismanagement by humans. We've not been doing what we're supposed to do out there on the West Coast, and we got these storms because it's just a stormy time that's where we're at. We'll go through 15 or 20 years after this, we won't have as many hurricanes. And then you know what? We'll go through another period in which we'll have a bunch of hurricanes and a bunch of storms happen. That's the way things go. It's the way seasons work. God tells us, right? As long as we're here, we're going to have seasons. You're going to have change. You're going to have the fall and the winter and the spring and all this stuff. So again, not that has anything to do with our lesson today, but it's just some ammunition for, just some knowledge for you to kind of tuck away. And as you kind of see some of this stuff, global warming is just such a hoax, and it's just been such a problem for people for many years now. Climate change is real; it's a real thing. Climate has been changing. It's going to continue to change, and it's going to change back and forth and back and forth. It's just what's going to happen. The Earth is a living organism. It's what it does. But it's nothing that's not happened before, and it's nothing that won't happen again until God comes back and kind of starts things anew. Okay, so not that that had anything to do with Balaam. Of course, Balaam was a guy that pretty intelligent and had lots of stuff he wanted to say as well. But I just wanted some cannon fodder for you there, some ammunition to be sticking your gun for later on in case somebody has an argument for you or somebody's trying to push on you that something that we have not been good stewards in totality as a human race of the world, and that's why we're seeing some of the things. But it's not man-made climate change is not. Well, we can have a real long discussion about that sometime if you want to. But man-made climate change is not a thing. All right, Numbers 22. We'll start in the first 40 verses. Actually, Balaam here, talking about Balaam. We'll start off with, is that working, Landon? Is it up yet? Right, you're the man. What y'all didn't know was that little spiel about the weather was just a stall. Oh, I'm kidding. Balaam is going to introduce himself now. I did a deep dive on Balaam this week on the internet and just different places. Balaam is, like I mentioned this last week, it's lesson 11, Landon. Balaam is a guy that is in a bunch of different ancient civilizations, right? There's stories about Balaam in a lot of, not just in the scriptures, but other ancient civilizations that were around this time. Canaanites and all these Amalekites, these people that are around during this time as well. Balaam is in some of their history books as well, okay? Which tells us that Balaam was maybe not so much an important person, but a very well-known person. And a lot of his well-knownness was by his own self-promoting, okay? Okay, he was very well versed in a lot of civilizations, very well versed in their education, and very well versed in their languages, and even in their religions. Okay, as a matter of fact, as we're going to see today, Balaam knew God by his covenantal name. Okay, and he also knew like the blessings of Israel. We see Balaam blessing Israel at one point during today's lessons, and he gives them messianic prophecies as well. Okay, so Balaam is well versed in kind of religion things, and he's very, very intelligent. And he was going around different places and talking about these to different people. And he's actually a really, really complicated character. And you could do a several-week study probably just on Balaam through history, not so much in the scriptures. You could go through just some of the history of civilizations and see some stuff about Balaam. He's a pretty intelligent, pretty complicated guy. But through scriptures, the accounts on Balaam, which bleeds over some into the New Testament as well, the account on Balaam here is very, very clear. Balaam thinks that he has the ability, he thinks he's smarter than everybody, so much even smarter than God. And he can outsmart, outthink, and overpower God, which of course is not the case. Now, Balaam was a notable diviner. Okay, which means religious man, all right, and was familiar again to many ancient people groups. Balaam's story, of course, the notoriety spills over into the New Testament. In 2 Peter and in Jude both, we see Balaam being presented as a person who profits from evil. There's multiple other passages as well that condemn Balaam. We're going to look at Balaam as a foreigner again who knew God, knew his covenantal name, and blessed Israel, came up with the messianic prophecies. But we're going to see what you think, well, that makes sense. God is using Balaam to bless Israel and give prophecies and stuff. But God's going to directly chastise Balaam, okay, for pursuing gain from Balak. And we'll get into who Balak is here in just a second. So the first 4 verses of Numbers 22. It's already 22. I've talked too much. And the children of Israel set forward and pitched in the plains of Moab on this side Jordan by Jericho. And Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. And Moab was sore afraid of the people because they were many. And Moab was distressed because of the children of Israel. And Moab said unto the elders of Midian, now shall this company lick up all that are around about us, as the ox licketh up the grass of the field. And Balak, the son of Zippor, was the king of the Moabites at that time. Okay, so Balak, the Moabite king, saw what Israel had just done to the Amorites and recognized the formidable force that the Israelites were, from a military standpoint and from the fact that that nation could come in and take over the Moabite nation. He realized how powerful that the Israelites were becoming, and he was concerned because of what he had just seen them do to the Amorites. So what is the king of Moab, Balak's, what's his disposition here towards Israel? He's scared of him, right? And he's scared of him because of just how large this population has gotten. And he's got some concern, okay? If you jump down to verse 8 in verse 9, we go to verse 7 first. And the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian departed with the reward of divination in their hand. And they came unto Balaam and spake unto him the words of Balak. And he said unto them, lodge here this night, and I will bring you word again, as the Lord shall speak unto me. And the princes of Moab abode with Balaam. And God came unto Balaam and said, what men are these with thee? Okay, so we see that the Moabites and the king sending out some people towards because he departed to Midian and going to seek out Balaam. Essentially what they're doing here. Okay, and they get to Balaam, and we see that they're coming in and explaining to Balaam essentially why the king here is concerned with the Israelites. And Balaam tells them to stay with him. Of course, see it in verse 8, lodge here this night, and I will bring word again, as the Lord shall speak unto me. And the princes of Moab abode with Balaam. And we see God actually speaking to Balaam here. God came unto at Balaam and said, "What men are these with thee?" Now, did Balak the king need to fear Israel? Go look at verse 8 and 9, okay? And does Balak have a need here to fear Israel? And the Lord said unto them, "Lo, did you hear this night? I will bring you word, and the Lord shall speak unto me." And the princes of Moab abode with Balaam. And God came unto Balaam and said, "What men are these with thee?" Go to verse 10, sorry. And Balaam said unto God, "Balak son of Zippor, king of Moab, hath sent unto me, saying, Behold, there is a people come out of Egypt, which covereth the face of the earth. Come now, curse me them peradventure. I shall be able to overcome them and drive them out." And God said unto Balaam, "Thou shalt not go with them. Thou shalt not curse the people, for they are blessed." Balak did not need to fear Israel because God had instructed Israel not to fight Moab. Okay, and if you look up in, where's that verse at? I didn't mark it. I forgot to mark it, but one of the verses up in there, God has instructed the Israelites that they have no need to fight against Moab. It was my fault for not marking what it is. So they did not have a. So they did not have a need. The king of Moab did not have a need here to fear Israel, as God had given them instructions not to fight Moab. All right. So Balak here, the king, he feared that the Israelites would overcome his land and his people, because the king here, Balak, was aware that Israel had defeated Sihon and Og, the king of Bashan. Okay, that was over in Numbers 21. In reality, Balak had nothing to fear because God had told Israel not to battle them. There it is, Deuteronomy. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 2. I knew I'd marked it. Just hadn't got to it yet in my notes. Deuteronomy chapter 2. Look at verses 8 and 9. Deuteronomy 2, verses 8 and 9. "And when we passed by from our brethren, the children of Esau, which dwelt in Seir, through the way of the plain, from Elath and from Ezion-Geber, we turned and passed by the way of the wilderness of Moab. And the Lord said unto me, Distress not the Moabites, neither contend them in battle, for I will not give thee of their land for a possession, because I have given Ar unto the children of Lot for possession." So they had no reason here. The king had no reason to fear the Israelites. God had instructed them not to conquer them, not to fight with them at all. Okay, God had promised that the land of the Moabites was not part of the promised land. That land of the Moabites belonged to the Moabites. Okay, not part of the promised land. But we see in desperation that Balak summons Balaam, an internationally known diviner who used a variety of things to determine God's will. Okay, Balaam was known to use animal entrails. He was used to know just nature around him, different things to determine God's will. Okay, so he had rituals that he went through, probably things he had pulled from other religions, and he was using these rituals to determine God's will. He also, in his divining, cursed and blessed people and tried to influence their gods. Okay. So again, Balaam, highly intelligent, well read, well understood. Also a bit of a charlatan, okay? He would do things to profit off these people's, worries for their fear of their gods and different things, and he had found a way to profit off of it. So he had some rituals, and he was well known, internationally known, as we see, for being a diviner, okay? Back in Numbers, so let's go to verse number 5 of chapter 22. "He sent messengers therefore unto Balaam the son of Beor to Pethor, which is by the river of the land of the children of the people, to call him, saying, Behold, there is a people come out from Egypt. Behold, I cover the face of the earth, and they abide over against me. Come now, therefore, I pray thee, curse me this people, for they are too mighty for me. Peradventure I shall prevail, that we may smite them, that I may drive them out of the land. For I wot that he whom thou blessed is blessed, and he whom thou cursest is cursed." So Balak seeks out Balaam and essentially asks Balaam to do what to the people of Israel? curse them, right? He asked them to curse them. I know you've done this before for other people. I don't want these people to come up against me and take over me, so I'm coming to you to curse these people. So how confident here is Balak, or Balak, however you want to say it, in Balaam's ability to influence essentially the course of history, right? What are the Israelites supposed to do? Take over the promised land, right? So how confident is Balak in Balaam's ability to influence the course of history? Pretty confident, isn't he? He really confident. He firmly believed that Balaam's blessings and his curses were always effective. All right? Now, he was not completely sure that even Balaam's curse, which would have been seemed to have been successful against other nations, would guarantee victory in the battle against Israel, but he firmly believed that these blessings and curse from Balaam were always effective. Balak believed that if Israel was cursed, then Moab and Midian would have a chance to defeat Israel despite the pretty apparent odds against them, okay? Because again, the size of the nation of Israel. Balak's words about Balaam's blessing and curses are really similar to God's words that he used to Abram in Genesis chapter 12 in verse 3, okay? We don't have time to flip back over there, but God said that what would happen to those that cursed Abram? He would do what? Curse thee that curse you, right? He was going, that was very specific. They would be cursed themselves. They were trying to curse Abram. So we see some similarities there in what Balak thinks that Balaam has the ability to do. Now, God's message was that all those who blessed Abram would be blessed, and all those who cursed him would be cursed. So Balaam here was in a no-win situation, right? Even if he did manage to curse Israel, and it was a successful curse, what would happen to Balaam? Based on what God said, he's going to be cursed, right? So he's in a no-win situation. So as we see what happens here, Balak then sends two entourages, two groups of people to Balaam, attempting him to convince, him to accept this job of cursing the Israelites. But as we see in verses 8 and 9 of chapter 22, God meets with Balaam before he responded to each of the requests, right? And we read this already, verse 7, the elders of Moab, Midian departed, rewards of divination in their hand. They came into Balaam and spake unto him the words of Balak, curse the Israelites. But we get to verse 9, and God came unto Balaam and said, what men are these with thee? And then we read, behold, there's a people coming out of Egypt which cover the face of the earth. Come now, curse me them peradventure, I shall be able to overcome them and drive them out. Verse 12, God said unto Balaam, thou shalt not go with them, thou shalt not curse the people, for they are blessed. Let me see the response in verse 13. And Balaam rose up in the morning and said unto the prince Balak, get ye into your land, for the Lord refuseth to give me leave to go with you. So God meets with Balaam before he responds to the request here of these people. And he instructs Balaam to deny the first request. Now, there's a whole list of things we could talk about here that we know that Balaam has had these rituals that he does to satisfy the people's needs to summon their gods. Okay? So we know that he is dabbling in false religions and false gods, okay, and profiting from it. But then we also see God doing what to Balaam? In verse 9. What does he do? Talks to him, right? Which you would think is a little bit strange, because we have a guy here who is, we wouldn't call him a righteous man. This Balaam is not Moses, okay? By no means is Balaam have the character that Moses has. Balaam doesn't even really have the character that Aaron has. And how many times have we seen God speaking directly to Aaron? Not very many, right? As a matter of fact, it was very, very late in Aaron's life that God spoke directly to Aaron. But we have this dude who's kind of a little bit of everything, right? It's a kind of mixed bag of all these different religions. We see God talking to him directly. and telling him that he needed to deny the first request that these people had of cursing God, which leads me to believe that there was some weight in Balaam's ability to curse and bless nations. I don't know how. I don't have a very good explanation for it, but there's a reason here that God is using Balaam to kind of be intervening in this situation. All right? And maybe it's because he's going to teach Balaam a lesson later on. Of course, we know that he does. But there's for whatever the reason, of course, we don't know why God would do this, but there's a reason here God is coming and speaking to Balaam directly. There has to be, there's some, I don't want to call it ability, but there's some weight in what Balaam has been able to do. Okay? Which is kind of an interesting. And again, I did some digging around. I really don't have a really good explanation why. Pastor Rob probably would have a better explanation why if I don't stick him on the spot like this. But I don't really have a really good one why. But he uses him. Of course, we'll see some of the consequences for his evil actions later on here in just a second. Now, many commentators view Balaam's words during these negotiations. Right? As we're going to see, if you go down to verse 20 of chapter 22, and God came unto Balaam at night and said unto him, If the men come to call thee, rise up and go with them, but yet the word which I shall say unto thee, thou shalt not do. So God tells Balaam to deny the first request, but then tells him on the second request, allows Balaam to accept the second request, but gives him some guidelines or some rules. The only caveat that Balaam had was that he was to do only what God said. Right, verse 20 at the end of it. But yet the word which I shall say unto thee, that shalt thou do. All right. Now, lots of commentators out there, lots of different ideas. Many commentators view Balaam's words during these negotiations as a ploy for a larger payment later on. Okay? And as we're going to see here, as we kind of finish these few verses up, the words he uses, he's trying to set himself up for a better reward later on. Nevertheless, Balaam rises early here in verse 21, and rises early and went with the princes of Moab. Verse 21, and Balaam rose up in the morning and saddled his ass, and went with the princes of Moab. And God's anger was kindled because he went, and the angel of the Lord stood in the way for an adversary against him. Now he was riding upon his ass, and his two servants were with him. God's response here to Balaam's actions is kind of surprising. As you see in verse 22, God's anger was kindled, right? Because he went, and the angel of the Lord stood in the way for an adversary against him. He was riding upon his ass, and his two servants were with him. The best explanation here is to use a couple of other passages to kind of aid our understanding and what's going on. So let's go to those real quickly. I've got 5 minutes. Let's go to 2 Peter. And chapter 2. Second Peter chapter 2, and look at verse 15. In 1 Peter, so that doesn't look right. Which have forsaken the right way and are gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Bosor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. Now jump over to Jude and look at verse 11. Woe unto them, for they have gone in the way of Cain, and have ran greedily after the error of Balaam for reward, and perished in the gainsaying of Korah. Okay, now we've talked about Korah a couple weeks ago, right? Korah was the guy that tried to lead a rebellion against Moses, against people, and it did not work out for him. So we see that both of these verses here are criticizing Balaam for trying to profit or gain from wrongdoing. Now, evidently, just looking at some cross references here, Balaam was motivated more by the desires to get riches from the king of Moab, from Balak, okay, than a desire to do what God wanted. So God told him to don't accept the first request, go ahead and accept the second request, and Balaam is doing this, and he's not going to follow through on the second request because God told him to. He's following through on the second request because he sees this as a way to profit from the king of Moab. Okay? So while he's doing what God is telling him, he's not doing it with the right heart. All right? He's seeing it more as a way to profit himself instead of being an actual blessing to the people of Israel that God is asking him to. Now, Balaam had met with God, right? We see two different instances here that God speaks to Balaam in some fashion, where I think that should have been a bit of a wake-up call for Balaam, because I'm sure God didn't just show up in front of him. I'm sure there was a voice that just spoke to him, or there would have been something that would not have been normal for him, but he still, even in the midst of having these two conversations with God, he apparently still believes that he has the ability to override God's will and gain from it, personal gain from it in some way. Okay? Now, maybe it's because he has previously been successful in getting other nations and doing his little rituals and then cursing and blessing nations and getting some gain from it. Maybe he's had some practice at this, right? Or he's had previous experiences where this has worked for him. And now he sees Israel, this huge nation, and the Moabites, this very wealthy nation, and he sees an opportunity for him to kind of get some gain and from that. Okay? So while he's doing what God wanted in some fashion, he is doing it for his own personal gain, and therefore he is unable to, he thinks that he should be able to override God's will and gain from it financially. All right? We're going to stop right there because I ran my mouth too much to start off with. But we're going to see next week in verse 23, Balaam's going to arrive. Okay? And of course, we know this story well. Right? This is when Balaam comes in on his donkey, and this is one of the more comical, I guess, stories in scriptures, because we see there in verse 22 that God sent the angel of the Lord. Verse 23, he sent the angel of the Lord against him, but he's going to stand in front of the donkey, of course, and cause the donkey not to move. Donkey talks about the good stuff that we'll get into next week. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the lesson we have today. Thank you for being able to kind of look, Lord, at some of the people who think that they, I don't want to put it as simply as outsmart you, Lord, but use you to kind of profit themselves. Try to, from a godly Christian viewpoint outwardly, kind of trick people into giving them things, or trying to find a way, Lord, to get some personal gain, using your name to get personal gain, but not doing it for your glory, doing it for their own fame and their own fortune, Lord. There's a ton of people out there all over TV, Lord, writing books and having podcasts and everything, Lord, they're doing this exact same thing. And a lot of Christians are falling for it. And a lot of people are falling for it. But Lord, you've said that those false prophets, those people, Lord, will be judged and will be judged mightily because of it. So I pray that you keep us, our ears perked and our hearts alert to some of the messages, Lord, that may seem on the surface to be doctrinally pretty good, Lord, but when we really begin to look at them, Lord, they become understanding that they're not the ways in which you'd have us to follow. So Lord, keep us attentive to those things. Keep us weary of those types of words being spoken, Lord, and being preached to people, Lord, so we don't fall for those traps as well. I pray for Pastor Rob here as he comes in the next little bit, Lord, and